Everyone, bienvenue à la 40...
Welcome to the 47th meeting of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Notre réunion...
Our meeting today, as in the past, will be held in a hybrid format.
For those participating virtually, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Since this is the first meeting of 2023, you may speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting in French, English, and Inuktitut. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, Inuktitut, English, or French. Please select your language now so that you'll be ready. And if interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately and we'll stop the process until we fix the problem. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name, or if you are in the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. Those in the room, your mic will be controlled as normal by the Proceedings and Verification Officer. S'il vous plaît, adressez.
Please direct your comments to the chair.
Please speak slowly and clearly. When you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. With regards to the speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do our best to respect the order in which people will be speaking. I would also like to ask the committee to consider the adoption of the budget for the Indigenous Languages Study. You've all received this by email. It covers meals and telephone lines. Do I have the committee's agreement? The agreement is unanimous. Lastly, I would like the committee to adopt the work plan that was circulated in December and which lays out the roadmap for the next 3 meetings of this study. Granted, the work plan is subject to change based on the availability of the witnesses, but do I have agreement with the work plan? Thank you. With that, we'll begin our study. Pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on November the 21st, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of Indigenous languages. Today, our first panel, we will welcome Ms. Carleen Ariak, who is the Language Commissioner of Nunavut, who is here in person with us today. Ms. Kitty Gordon from the Office of the President of the Makivik Corporation, who is also with us in person today, and Mr. Mark Nelson and Ed Schultz of the Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation, who are representing 25 self-governing Indigenous governments. For the benefit of our witnesses, we provide you with 5 minutes to make some introductory remarks. We'll go through the witnesses, the 3 witnesses, and then Mr. Nelson and Mr. Schultz, you'll share your 5 minutes, and then we will go to questions from the committee members. So with that, I would like to invite Ms. Carleen Ariak to begin the proceedings today with a 5-minute introductory opening. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson, for inviting me here and all the members here. I am happy to be sitting here with you. I will be talking about how it is in Nunavut because it is very unique and different from other areas of Canada. Now, in terms of Inuit, our language, Inuit language, Inuktitut, and there's Inuit and Inuktitut. As a language commissioner in Nunavut, I am talking in my language to show support, that we are in support, that we are fighting to keep our languages alive. I will switch to English now.
Our duty is to promote and safeguard the language rights of Nunavut. Nunavut has 2 distinct languages acts, and that's the Official Languages Act that recognizes, as I mentioned, the Inuit language, English and French, and the Inuit Language Protection Act, and I'm just going to go through the differentiations between those 2 for a minute. So OLA, the Official Languages Act, recognizes Inuktitut, English, and French as our territory's official languages. It creates important obligations for the Nunavut government departments and public agencies, the Legislative Assembly, and the Nunavut courts to serve the public in all the official languages. The federal government and organizations from the private sector don't have to comply with OLA, but by contrast, the Inuit Language Protection Act was designed specifically to counter, among other things, the negative effects of colonization, or, quote, the past government actions and policies of assimilation, and the existence of government and societal attitudes that cast the Inuit language and culture as inferior and unequal. Therefore, acknowledging that these actions, policies, and attitudes have had a persistent negative and destructive impact on the Inuit language and Inuit, unquote. Moreover, at a minimum, Section 13.1 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples proclaims the right of Indigenous peoples to, quote, to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literature, and to designate and retain their names for communities, places, and persons, unquote. Federal agencies, departments, and institutions have a legal and moral obligation to comply with Nunavut's legislation. Canada commits itself to respecting the UNDRIP Declaration for the Indigenous People, and federal agencies, departments, and institutions in Nunavut have to comply with the ILPA, and when I say ILPA, that's the Inuit Language Protection Act in Nunavut. But the Office of the Languages Commissioner of Nunavut we continue to receive, concerns involving federal agencies, departments, and institutions in Nunavut. And the issues my office faces is in addressing concerns involving the federal agencies, departments, and institutions in Nunavut are the following: the lack of response from the obligated federal agencies, departments, and institutions, and or the absence of tools to enforce their compliance with the law, even if the complaints are admissible. This is especially concerning because federal agencies, departments, and institutions in Nunavut are accountable for the lack of Inuktitut in their oral communications, public signs, posters, reception, and client services as required under ILPA.
There are many Nunavut mute speak. Primary language is Inuktitut, and they speak their primary language is in their home, but that is being lost now as the studies that were conducted by Statistics Canada. They were studying to see if Inuktitut was being kept alive or is it being lost. Now, in 2016, the researchers that found that the people who can speak their language in their home is 23,225, or 65.3%. This is these are the statistics in Nunavut. And also the Truth and Recreation Commission found that 23,970, or 52.9% of Nunavut residents were able to speak in their language, which is Inuktitut. This is a growing concern for us.
and positive actions are more important than ever. I'd like to get to a few of the concerns and examples of the concerns our office receives.
Ms. Ariak, I'll have to ask you to wrap up because we have a lot of questions that are going to come.
Okay. I'll just get to one of the examples. I can get to more later. Information related to health, like the mass required sign posted on a door during election, was only in English, while there are unilingual voters in the community. So to address these concerns, I'm recommending the following administrative and legislative tools, which I believe are vital for implementing and enforcing the existing law. A memorandum of understanding is recommendation number 1. Establish an MOU with federal agencies, departments, and institutions in Nunavut. This will be the mechanism to improve communication on language issues and resolve them while concerns are raised about a federal institution in Nunavut. Recommendation number 2, which is a legislative tool, to hold the Privy Council accountable for the implementation of recommendations on languages issues in Nunavut and ultimately in Canada. To establish a clear time frame for federal agencies, departments, and institutions operating in Nunavut to respond to our office's recommendations. In conclusion, the adoption in 2007 by the vast majority of countries around the world of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was a historical moment when UN states and Indigenous peoples reconciled with their painful histories and resolved to move forward together on the path of human rights, justice, and development for all. Moreover, UNDRIP declares 2022 as the beginning of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages to ensure Indigenous peoples' rights to preserve, revitalize, and promote their languages. Therefore, it's imperative for all federal agencies, departments, and institutions operating in Nunavut to commit to taking all positive and necessary steps for the implementation of the Inuit Languages Protection Act and the usage, preservation, revitalization, and promotion of the Inuit language in Nunavut. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ariak. We'll now
Thank you.
minutes.
I am Kitty Gordon from Kudjuk. I grew up in Kudjuk. My mother, my grandmother, my grandparents, and family brought me up. Nunaving Muta.
Roughly 14,000 inhabitants, spread out into 14 communities. Approximately 90% of Inuktitut speaking are living in Nunavik, Inuktitut speaking Inuit, which is higher than other regions as compared to the rest of Canada. Language to us is an integral part of our identity. Although it might be a small population, there are 3 distinct dialects in Nunavik which contributes furthermore to our uniqueness. Sadly, our language is rapidly eroding. Traditional knowledge is passed down from generation to generation, primarily through oral history, learned from one generation to the next. I'm here today on behalf of Makivik, the birthright organization who represents the Inuit of Nunavik. Makivik is an inception of the first modern-day treaty in Canada known as the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. And as we learn over the years, we are beginning to see that this agreement was more or less forced on our young Inuit leaders at the time. So how can we protect our language? In our region, we have the Avatak Cultural Institute, and who is a key player for language and culture in Nunavik. Illiriyavut, a report that came out in 2012, contains several recommendations on language and how to keep it alive. Makivik works in partnership with Avatak. Inuktitut in Nunavik. As I mentioned before, language is alive but eroding. Generational gaps, sadly, the language is being diminished between the generations. We're not looking for standardization. Dialects are distinct, and we want to maintain it that way.
Mako avit to se maningitigo mak ili o house kati o house ala adjiging cheso ngi mata tamako inutito a ili saigo tit pilari vil lo pina so vil inutito a o kalima vi khatareli amarutai ko a ili tagaya ugalwalo te inutito pio sakpakasangitun Tamakwali inutitun o housing no kamazi leut pimario no novemmi tamakwalo kina yan aula juta khare hapat tutsirauti khattare hamimata tamakko like $1.4 million ni to halaw mimman tan tuanga jo akuni atoktu samangolo ni taimaro tan kwato sugi nuna vimion kanoktu te khaguna lautun kilisini aron nasitsuting naldingin primario no pa mga ta sibuli tau jage hamata tamanailan ruhausitinning asit just ta kwa anga khatigi ko tawat akka ko tamakina la hatti ko tawat atu tsere hamata tamakwalo atu tsere hakatigo.
Thank you, Ms. Gordon. Just on the interpretation, the Inuktitut was coming through on the English channel, so perhaps the technicians can look at that just before we go to... He's on his way. Okay, good. And thirdly, our witnesses, Mr. Nelson and Mr. Schultz, you'll have 5 minutes. I'm not sure whether one of you will speak for the 5 minutes or whether you'll share it, but please go ahead and we're ready.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity, and I will speak over quickly. We want to leave plenty of time for questions. I'm very fortunate to be with one of the self-governing Indigenous governments of 24 who have been working over the last 2 years on a model in terms under the collaborative fiscal process with Canada, which we've been working on since 2017. It's very much in keeping with all the modern treaties that we have with Canada, the obligations and so forth. I just want to emphasize that language, of course, is, as we just heard, essential to Indigenous peoples' identities and a key basis of our well-being. And there's a big issue related to the negative social indicators that we're always challenged with, sometimes with our people, is the lack of their knowledge of our languages. Language, culture, and identity are also essential foundations for our self-government. It was the premise of entering into modern treaties with Canada, but yet is one of the most weakest funded parts that we have. Critical time for self-governing Indigenous languages is a critical time. Most have only a few remaining speakers of the 26, very few. And the model draws on expertise researched about approaches that truly support languages by creating speakers and how they should be implemented. I was kind of tossed up between just saying what I wanted to say versus what I was told to give you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon to the members of the committee. So as Ed said, Little Seven Carmacks First Nation and other self-governing Indigenous governments have been working together with Canada on updating Canada's fiscal policy on self-government and building out what is the expenditure need for various areas of responsibility, including Indigenous languages. And our work over the last couple of years has been on building a model of expenditure need for what is needed on the ground by these Indigenous governments to support their language. And as Ed mentioned, with very few remaining speakers, the focus is on immediate and focused immersion type approaches that will pass the language from the remaining speakers to a new generation. So this is intensive programs such as full-time adult immersion done in cohorts of about 10 people, preschool language nest for the young children, mentor apprentice programs for more one-on-one intensive learning, and silent speaker support for people who understand the language but don't speak it actively. And in building the expenditure need model, we looked at assessing what is needed to actually implement those programs on the ground in a way that they're effective. So we looked at existing examples, we looked at the realities on the ground in the communities. We identified what do we think is the base capacity needed to put those programs into practice, and what's the incremental capacity you might need as the population of the community increases and there's going to be more demand on those programs. And what are some of the operational costs involved to do things like on-the-land learning through cultural activities? What are the resources needed for creating multimedia tools in support of that learning? So all of this was built into the expenditure need model. And as I mentioned, this is all part of the work with the federal fiscal policy process. And we're working towards with Canada, with Department of Canadian Heritage and CIRNA to put forward a proposal for a phased implementation of this model that allows the Indigenous governments to build up their capacity over time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nelson and Mr. Schultz, and thank you to our witnesses for your opening remarks. We'll now proceed to a question period, the first round, each of 6 minutes, beginning with the Conservatives. Mr. Zimmer, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Happy New Year. Just wanted to say thank you again for coming to committee all the way from Nunavut. It's a long ways away. Was there this summer. Many have heard that story probably too many times, but beautiful area. And it's a little colder than here right now up there. It's about minus 30 plus. So anyway, recently I was visiting the Kitsalis band in BC with our leader, Pierre Polyev. And one of the things we were honored to be briefed on was how they were trying to preserve their language. And what was highlighted by other colleagues on the call today or in the meeting today was that some of the elders, there's not a whole lot necessarily left depending on the community. And also to help that process, there isn't a lot of youth that are able to kind of put that down on paper to really translate and get the language down. So it made me want to ask you some questions about and concerns around how can we be doing better? Certainly there's been, in 2019 it was announced that the government was gonna proceed, and since then there's been almost $1 billion allocated to sort of make this happen. And Carlin, I heard you say what was some things that needed to be still fixed, but I want to dig into that a little bit more about outcomes, because I think we want to see that this is actually getting done, and there's a lot of challenges around it. But and I'll start with Carlin, we'll go to Kitty after. What still needs to be done? What can be done better to achieve the outcomes? And we heard about long-term funding and those kind of things, but here's some time to just say, well, this is, if it was me doing this, this is what I would do. We'll start with Carlin.
Oh, you're going to make Mr. Zimmer?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmer.
Talk about my jurisdiction in Nunavut. And my mandate as the Languages Commissioner is to ensure that people are aware of their language rights. And when Nunavummiut feel that their language rights have been infringed, they can send us a concern, and we then investigate those concerns and whether a language rights has been infringed on. The fact that my office is still receiving concerns from Nunavummiut is an indicator that there are still a lot of work to be done. In terms of funding, I can't, so my role is to ensure that people are aware of their language rights and to make the obligated bodies aware of their language obligations. In terms of funding, that's where in the Inuit Language Protection Act, there's 3 distinct offices. The Minister of Languages, which is with the Department of Culture and Heritage with the Nunavut government, and then there's an Inuit Language Authority that is mandated to standardize terminology and to preserve traditional terminology. So in terms of the fact that my office is still receiving concerns, the recommendations we've been putting out there are not being addressed. Hence that recommendation to have one central agency within the government because they are obligated in Nunavut to comply with the Inuit Language Protection Act. And there's many different government departments and agencies. To have one particular agency, I mentioned the Privy Council. I'm open to discussions. Maybe it's the Treasury Board, maybe it's the Heritage Canada, but I'm open to those discussions because evidently the fact that I'm still receiving concerns as a languages commissioner, the language rights obligations are not being met by the federal government specifically.
Sure. Thank you. Kitty?
As for Nunavik, firstly, we're still under the jurisdiction of Quebec, so we don't have a self-government per se. But there are recommendations that have been set forth by the Iliriyavut report, which was written by Zebedee Nungak and Arami Halingo. And in there were they had identified recommendations that came out from workshops and different meetings that were held in the region. And so I think it's a matter of having meetings with the youth and the elders and trying to bridge the gap between the two generations and make it so that it's attractive for the youth to go to, because there are many different activities and workshops that do take place in the communities, but nobody shows up because it doesn't sound interesting. I think it's also in the way the delivery is done, just to attract as much youth as we can, is to get participation.
And our members via Zoom, any response to that as well? Go ahead.
Sure. What I would say, I can't speak for all 24 self-governing Indigenous governments. They span from the north to the south and across the country under different provincial and territorial jurisdictions. But I can say from a Yukon context, and I would say from a more boilerplate observation, is that we firmly believe, at least in my community here and in this territory, we need greater community delivery of programs and services. Centralized systems have been tried for decades, and they do not work well. But any community initiatives, although lowly funded, have turned out even better results, more sustainable results. And the model that the SGIGs have now developed with Canada and CERNAC and Heritage, I think really delivers the options for unique communities with unique circumstances to develop the community programming necessary to make, I think, significant improvements in closing the gap between fluent speakers and a new generation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmer. We'll go to Ms. Atwin for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's nice to see our committee members back after the new year, and thank you so much to our witnesses for joining us today for such an important discussion. I'd like to direct my questions to start off to Commissioner Ariak, and thank you so much for speaking in your language, and please feel free to do that at any time, because it's one of the great honors of this committee is we get to have Inuktitut interpretation, which I think is kind of this really bold step in the right direction. And then I can't help but think about communities in my riding, where I represent, and where Wolastoq-Gao-Ladawai-Wagan is extremely threatened. It's a small community of speakers and very few few, who are elders are left who speak the language. So I'm just wondering, from your position, with your experience, what advice could you offer to language keepers and to those who are invested in language revitalization across the country?
Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me here. Now, in Nunavut, when the Language Act was passed in Nunavut became Nunavut in 1999, and the Language Act was passed after that Nunavut Day. So, because that was an act, we had a language act that came from Northwest Territories or Nunatsiavut. Then we had to develop our own act that would be in Nunavut for Nunavut. Now, before I even came here, before I even became a commissioner, I was told, let us not be shy to use our language anymore. Let us not be afraid to use it. Let us keep our language alive. Now, those are the very words that are written in that act. That is what makes our Language Act so unique. And the elected members that are political activists in the past have had to use their language, struggled when they were using their language because Inuktitut was not very much utilized. Now in order to keep our language alive, we have to start in the home, in the schools. Like when you walk, we walk left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. That is the way we can begin to keep and sustain our language and utilize it more. Although the language is strong in Nunavut, our population is diminishing. Many are dying out, and many are losing their own heritages. There are many who struggle with their own language. Like, for instance, somebody said if they went out on the camp, they can go learn their language out on the land. We do that in Nunavut. There are many dialects. There are many concerns that were brought up because we're struggling to keep those alive. They are our values, and we are fighting to keep our language alive. If the elected members are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, we have to bring it to their attention. There are many types of technologies available, like Microsoft. They negotiated they were able to. Microsoft came up with if you write something in English, you can be quickly translated into Inuktitut just by using cell phones and televisions and other forms of technologies. There are some in Nunavut now. I hope you will come up and check this unique and amazing device. Thank you.
I think the technology piece is really interesting. And I'd love to hear more, Ms. Gordon, about the Cultural Institute, because I think that's a really interesting concept as well, if you could just share a bit about how that's going.
Well, the Avatar Cultural Institute is an independent entity that represents our culture, that is there to safeguard our culture and language. But again, this is an entity that lacks funding. So they are limited to what they can do within our communities. There's a dictionary project that's taking place right now, in the process of getting it corrected and relooked at. But again, they are limited to what they can do because it is a private entity and it's fairly small. It's very important for our identity and culture, but again, there's always lack of funding for programs that they want to create.
Thank you, Ms. Hatwin. Nous irons maintenant.
We will now go to Ms. Beribe. Ms. Beribe for 6 minutes. Thank you to all of the witnesses for their presentations. My writing is Abitibi by James, and so I understand the explanations about the language. I went to Upaluk before the holidays, and I saw what happens a little bit, and I want to return in the month of April for longer to Iwichi and Nunavik. So my question would be to the representatives of the Salmon First Nation. I'd like to talk about the need to have long-term funding. As this study on Indigenous languages goes forward, we've seen that people who come speak to us, whether they're members of a First Nation or Métis Inuit, need predictability. Protecting a language is long-term work. It's difficult to do this work without an assurance that the money will be there. You've talked in your presentations about recurring funding of $80 million. This shows the need and the lack of funding in Indigenous languages, in my opinion. You also talk about a need of $900+ million over the next decade. Could you elaborate on the importance of long-term funding for the revitalization of Indigenous languages? And in your opinion, why is there such a lack of funding? It's for you.
Go ahead, Mr. Schultz.
Just towards me. Merci, Cho. There's a lot of ground covered in your questions and your observations, and I thank you for them. Many of our people think there are many parallels with the Francophone language and our Indigenous languages. I think, however, our observation here has been that over the course of the last 100 years, there's been mostly deliberate colonial practices and policies that were designed to kind of weed out our language and to weed out our practices. In many cases, it's on the law books that some things were outlawed, whether it was dancing or singing, and in some cases, speaking the language. So we're trying to reverse a trend that's well over 100 years old, where the colonial system spent billions of dollars to kind of get the language out of our people. And we are saying, in the spirit of reconciliation today, that as much of an effort should be brought forward to help us to reintroduce it or to sustain it while it's still alive. And like all languages, whether it's of any place, anywhere, there is sustained funding for its continued use, its growth, and for its development over the course of time. Unfortunately, it's not unique to Canada that Indigenous languages are vastly underfunded or not funded at all. It's usually through volunteer efforts and the sincere hearts of others who are trying to make sure that it survives. And I want to share with you why that's so important related to your question really quickly. We deal in Canada and as First Nations with a lot of negative social indicators of our peoples. That's low education rates, incarceration rates, low health conditions, low unemployment, etc. And those negative social conditions have been around. Our summation is, by many of the First Nations and the SGIGs, is that we are dealing with a lost people, a people trapped somewhere in between two worlds, a modern Western world and our way, and have been deliberately moved away from that and are lost. And why are they lost? They're lost because embedded in our language is the values, the customs, the traditions, the beliefs that we have as Indigenous people that really ground us for who we are, like all languages do for all people. So we're kind of in this weird place and time. And so we believe that the long-term sustained funding is necessary to not only to help preserve Indigenous languages for that sake, but to bring other value and healthy communities back to our communities, healthy families, and where we really will make a difference on the symptoms, which I call the negative social indicators, and really start making some true good relationships here in Canada. Thanks.
If I'm able to follow up.
Yes.
Nelson.
Thank you. Sorry, apologies if I cut you off. About the need for consistent funding, I'd like to tie that into the previous question about outcomes as well. I think, as Ed touched on, the need for consistency in community programs on the ground so that you can build momentum and get people involved and build on success and be able to do that without having to worry year to year about proposal-based funding is really key. And you need to do it in intensive programs that actually have results on the ground. So a great example would be these adult immersion programs where people commit to full-time learning over a period of a couple years, and they are actually paid for their time to do that, where they take it on as a full-time job to become the learners of the language so that they're passing it on to the next generation. This has been proven to work on the ground and to create very high level intermediate to semi-fluent speakers in a couple years, but it needs intensive effort and resources to do it. It's very clear now that spending a couple hours a week and maybe reading some storybooks in the evening is not enough to take a language from being not used consistently to being the living language of the community. So this goes to the question of the level of resources that are needed to put those kind of intensive programs into effect. The resources committed so far are substantial, but when you spread them out over the vast number of Indigenous communities, they don't amount to enough to implement those kind of intensive programs on the ground. So that's what we've costed out in our modeling.
Merci, Madame Berry.
Thank you, Ms. Berube. Now we will go to Ms. Idlout for 6 minutes. Ms. Idlout.
The floor is yours.
Thank you for all our presenters, and I am so happy to see our two witnesses here, not because we can speak in our language. And our language is made understandable by our interpreters. We are so blessed because our language is precious to us. And we have to keep reiterating how precious our language is and how important it is to who we are and to our culture. When others begin to understand how precious our language is, then they will be more encouraged, more inspired to keep giving us support in areas where we need it. And when acts and bills are proposed, many bills and proposals or acts are developed, and bills and acts will keep being made, and I'm pretty sure in the future that because it declares that we can get support and we can get funding according to the acts or the bills that have been passed. I want to ask, does the bill suffice? Do you have adequate funding? If you don't have adequate funding, how much more is needed to be allocated to Indigenous peoples? We have been told over and over again that there's limited funding. There's not enough monies. And this is like becoming beginning to sound like a scratched record, because that's all we hear. And we have to come up with a way and form our questions. How can we get more support? How can we get more funding to implement these programs, to implement the programs of reviving our language? I'm pretty sure that there will come a day when the federal government will finally be able to meet our needs and hear what we're saying, because our descendants are relying on us today to make sure that our language is not getting lost. I think how much more funding do we need to implement the programs of revitalizing our language, our Indigenous languages? And Carleen or Kitty, it would be great if you could answer that question. Thank you. Perhaps we can do a research globally to see if there are some countries where there were Indigenous peoples that lost their language, and if they've managed to revive it. That will be a start. That will be a great area to start, is to conduct a study on Indigenous peoples globally. I cannot give a specific number, but I can say there's lots. Now, one example I wanted to bring up is that for federal government agencies, although we do get funding, there's no additional funding. If someone, say, was bilingual in French and Inuktitut, yeah, they get additional funding. But they go through the same struggles to keep their language alive. When we have to ask, like the French language, the French people, they get additional funding to keep their language alive. As Inuit, how come we don't get the same equal treatment? We're not treated equally. Many things are getting more expensive today. The inflation is rising.
Doktaw yun naluak doktaw ukaw si tinik agsuhod sa kangnak pata amaru tako government could narunak si ming mataylang andrip ngun nakakatakta miksano kisiani sakyak titikan nariyarit agsuhukan nariyarit piliriyamin ilwani sila tani lunin.
Within the system or outside the system? Thank you. 2 minutes okadlagun nakotsi. Pasukan na napugon. Mr. Mililo. Kaya da make sabaw tao. Okadlayak tuktulo kaya na mapaka. Tamatuming okaw sa kaktilo tao. Okaw sa make pimaringming. Miss Ariak. Titrak Vigo. Titrak titawang man.
In some of the other examples, would you be able to share those with us to give us a bigger picture?
Thank you. So there's a few on Elections Canada, and I spoke to those during another committee. Inuktitut was missing on posters and ballots during the last federal election in Nunavut, and we had received concerns in the previous federal election to the same effect, which is an indicator to me that the first recommendations were not addressed if I was receiving those same concerns regarding federal elections in the last federal election. Information related to health, like the mask required sign, was only in English. Posters in a federal facility were in English and French only. And the last example I had on here that I just briefly touched on from Lori's question is, so when we receive concerns, I am obligated to investigate them and find out whether they are admissible or inadmissible. So is there a law that's being infringed or not? In special cases, like for this one, for example, that I'm going to talk about briefly, Inuit public servants in Nunavut are not paid a bilingual bonus, even if Inuktitut is required to perform their duties in the territory. So the Nunavut government goes through assessments. If an employee wants to be assessed on the level of their Inuit language proficiency, they get assessed by an independent assessor, and then the employees, depending on the level, 1, 2, or 3, receives that extra pay. It's an incentive to encourage employees to give service and learn more of their language. It's the same concept as what the federal government does with its French language bonus. So federal government employees, when they get assessed, they go through the assessment process, same concept, level 1, 2, or 3, and then depending on their competency, they get remunerated in that way. In Nunavut...
Thank you. We'll just have to go on to the next. Mr. Baptiste, for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I guess my question, as a fluent Indigenous speaker who lives in an Indigenous community who's seeing, despite the fact that we have an immersion school, despite the fact that we have all kinds of resources available, that our youth are still speaking English as a social practice. I'm wondering if there are what's the best practices right now that you've seen, and to utilize any kind of ways to bring the language back. We always talk about funding. There's not enough funding. But what are the top 3 things that we could be funding if we're to get results in bringing back the language?
Well, I think maybe if we go see where the youth are today, TikToks. I think everybody, all my children, everybody I see up north is TikTok is everywhere. Everybody has it. So I think maybe a TikTok account with language specifically, if it can be created, and if it could be as simple as 2-3 words a day, and then we can, make sure we could see that it's reaching the youth. So I think maybe going where the youth is, whatever social media they're using, we'll be able to reach them in any which way possible.
Sure. Early childhood is so important. There's currently in Nunavut, there's apps that you can acquire. They're free, and that's towards preschoolers. And that's geared towards the writing system and hearing and learning the grammar. Everything from having media, radio. We specifically have 2 television channels now in the Inuit language, which focuses on covering what's happening around Inuit Nunangat, but also ensuring that it's exposing more people to language. There's many different ways, and there's so many different resources, but also encouraging even first-time learners or early learners to encourage them to continue learning. Learning never ends. There's no graduation of learning of anything. And and
Thank
the
you.
importance at
I'm
home.
not picking on you, Ms. Riak. Just tight on the time. Madame Bérubé, pour 2 minutes.
Ms. Bidibé for 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question will be for Ms. Gordon. You know that this study is on Indigenous Languages Act, which was put in place in 2019 by the federal government. So my question is simple. Have you seen differences in the funding or the administration or government support for your communities since the adoption of the Act?
Malheureusement, Madame Berube.
Unfortunately, Ms. Bidibé, I'm not able to answer you today for that question, but I wanted to share earlier that I share the same feelings as Mr. Schultz mentioned earlier. Thank you. I'll ask the question to the other witnesses as well. The Indigenous Languages Act, has it changed anything?
Okay, so perhaps Mr. Schultz, you can have a quick stab at that.
Certainly, I can say on the ground, no. I think we're still looking at how the full measure of the Languages Act is going to be rolled out and implemented. There's ongoing dialogue from centralized groups like the AFN and Congress Aboriginal Peoples, etc., the Nunavut, Inuit, our groups. There's so many different people involved in a rollout of that one piece of legislation, which is really looking at a centralized approach. Still an advocate that we really need to get in the communities where the language lives and where it's still living. It will never be delivered by a centralized approach, and that's my honest opinion. Thank you.
Ms. Ariak, you have about 15 seconds if you want to throw something. Okay. We'll go to Ms. Idlaut for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I wanted to listen to Inuktitut, so I'm going to ask the two Inuktitut speakers. I enjoy talking in my own language. What would you propose as a recommendation to change and to improve the Indigenous Languages Act if it's going to be promoted more to our communities and to be more widely understood? How would you go about improving it? Carlene and Kitty. Which the Indigenous Languages Act itself, yes. I had recommendations that were directed to government earlier, but we also have to understand and recognize that a national legislation in Canada has to be known in Canada that Nunavut has a language act that protects Inuktitut and a protection act. We have a protection act. People need to know that in Canada. We have many struggles, not just the act itself, but our language has been undermined for many, many years. I will let her respond. I know that the federal government employees go to Inuit communities. They need to be more visible in the Inuit community so they have a better understanding of our language today and where it stands. They can get a better appreciation for language protection acts that will protect Inuit languages. We need you to understand all the things from the Inuit community perspective, so come to us. Ms. Idlaut.
Mr. Nelson, thank you for taking the time to appear in person and virtually. Thank you for your opening remarks and answering our questions on this important study. Very clearly, you've informed this committee of where we're at and where we need to go with respect to Indigenous languages, so it's very much appreciated. Thank you for coming today. And with that, we will pause very briefly to prepare for the second panel. Thank you. Us today in person. As well, Danielle Alphonse, BC Regional Innovation Chair for Aboriginal Early Childhood Development, Vancouver Island University, by video conference. And that's it. I think, oops, I guess I'm missing a page here in my, oh, I'm sorry. My apologies. Melanie Griffith-Bryce, Associate Professor, and Gabrielle Dumont, Research Chair in Métis Education, University of Regina, also by video conference. Welcome to you as well. The way we proceed is that each of the witnesses we'll have 5 minutes to make introductory remarks, after which we'll have questions. In the case where you're more than one, you share the 5 minutes and as you wish. So with that, I would like to invite our first witness, Ms. Huron, to take the microphone for introductory remarks for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Kwekwe, and thank you for having me here today. I am the Director of Indigenous Education at Capilano University and was formerly the Director of Languages at the Assembly of First Nation while the Act was being written. And so I'd like to acknowledge the Algonquin territories that we're on today and the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam territories that I work, live, and am an uninvited guest on. At my own nation, I am Mattawa North Bay Algonquin, and I'm very proud to be back here in these lands. So the Indigenous Languages Act was an incredible first step in the recognition of Indigenous language rights. It was Canada's first act that recognized the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and assured adequate, predictable, and sustainable funding for language resurgence. The establishment of the Indigenous Language Commission was also an important move in ensuring that language issues will continue to be heard here in Ottawa. Now, reviewing this act through its initial implementation during COVID-19 pandemic is particularly difficult, so acknowledging that the work you're doing here. But we should also look to this experience as further highlighting the precariousness of the vitality of our languages. UNESCO reported that the majority of our speakers are above the age of 50, and this demographic has been particularly at risk during the pandemic. Our languages, the longest, most enduring repository of knowledge of the history of this land, are in a palpable state of fragility. After 3 years, we need to question whether what the aim of this policy is. Are we looking at sustaining Indigenous languages as secondary languages with the unfortunate potential, the outcome that students taking language classes in school remember only a few sentences in their adulthood? Or are we looking at language resurgence, where we invest in developing sustainable language economies, much like what has been created for the minority official languages? If territorially based language official status is not on the immediate horizon, can we support instituting languages as languages of public affairs, as has been done in Taiwan, to begin to create these language economies? We have yet to see real progress in Section 8 and 9 of the Indigenous Languages Act, in particular pertaining to the coordination between the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments. The last speakers spoke to that, especially where we have such an advanced piece of legislation in Nunavut that has had to backstep because this federal legislation isn't working to support everything within that territorial legislation. Without this coordination, confusion and lack of motivation will prevail, especially when engaging with complicated issues such as our support of Indigenous languages in education, healthcare, and the justice system. Much like with Jordan's principle, we cannot lose our languages due to the quagmire of finger-pointing and resultant negligence that comes with federal, provincial, and territorial jurisdictional boundaries that were imposed on our nations by the colonial project. The federal, provincial, territorial coordination affects how post-secondary institutions respond to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee's calls to actions, particularly 16 and 62.2. Targeted funding allocations to support a response to language needs within a post-secondary context have yet to take place. These funds should not come from the funding highlighted within the Act, as those funds are established specifically for Indigenous organizations. Provinces and territories must allocate funding within their budgets for post-secondary institutions to respond to these calls, funding that is above and beyond what Indigenous groups require for their own internal language resurgence programming. It's been normalized for post-secondary institutions to do this work based on existing funding, which typically exploits the labors of Indigenous faculty and staff, who are required to do more with less. There's also a need for discussions on how to do this work without creating additional work for community members who are overburdened creating their own language programming. Language workers are often doing this work without significant support. I know of one teacher who has all of her materials stored in her car because of lack of office space. This infrastructure needs supporting as well. Many of these workers are frustrated by their lack of capacity to chase down funding while working more than full-time to sustain their language. Others face the challenges of having to advocate for their work when they may only have 1 or 2 students. This cannot be a numbers game. These students, whether in small or large numbers, are the ones keeping their languages alive until others are ready. These language workers are looking far into the distance, to the next 7 generations and beyond, and so should the Government of Canada. Jim Gwetch.
Thank you, Ms. Huron. We'll now go to Ms. Alphonse for 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Sapka Siem, Tanitsin at Wasanich and Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I'd like to thank the ancestors past, present, and future. Neith na Shiit Mistimo, A Siem, na Sahwain, na Siatya, na Eli Shwalakwa, Height Sapka, Kwasi Ella Patanaquel, Height Sapka. So my opening statement is focusing on the keywords inclusion, early childhood, multiple diversity, and equity and access. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples are diverse in their efforts to save their languages. The complexity is not only the many dialects, but how to capture the reality that many Indigenous peoples live in their community on reserve, or they live in urban communities away from home. A significant challenge and an opportunity are to design and track the progression of each 70 language groups and determine with each nation a long-term plan, ensuring future nations are able to speak their language. Commitment to policy and reconciliation. I believe education is the answer to support and revitalize multiple languages. As a lifelong trajectory from baby from home to early childhood to post-secondary. And examples that I included are thinking about the language nest in New Zealand that started with the Maori people, the success of language immersion within Canada, and the continued development of community-based capacity. So not only thinking about language nests in early childhood, but also thinking about family nests for community and family homes and sacred healing nests for elders and residential school survivors. Advancing all Indigenous languages are not only the rights of Indigenous children and families, but all Canadians and connected to our land and our ancestors. And they have the right to learn multiple Indigenous languages. Regarding equity and allocation of funds, that needs to be quite visible for all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And I recognize again the diversity of our language dialects. They are valued, authentic, and are different revitalization stages, a spectrum. Representation of all nations need to be a critical piece in decision making. Again, accountability regarding a transparent picture of all language loss with all nations. As language loss affects every community in our healing resilience in our identity. Indigenous leadership and government need to articulate variables, administration, community and language resurgence and recovery evaluation processes. There needs to be an Indigenous assessment on their language recovery and language function for all nations. Regarding post-secondary and early childhood programs in Canada, I think it's mandatory for all early childhood programs that are licensed to teach Indigenous languages and to support educators in mentorship, resources, and professional development with ongoing funding. And supporting funding for post-secondary early child programs, education, child and youth care, and social work. In regards to research, I keep thinking about the online learners and they're using the apps, the youth, and how will government be able to develop a tool to show the efficacy with people learning online? Another issue is bridging the disconnect of online platforms by creating a collaboration with shared responsibility about community and post-secondary initiatives. And each language group should have online accessibility and agreements with the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people with post-secondary to community members wanting to access their language. Nations should have the right to their ownership of their language and be able to access it from any post-secondary. I was just wanting to follow up on the two pilot projects with the NISCA and the Nunavut project for the last 2 years. And I really want to acknowledge with deep gratitude to the elders in my community who have been working really hard to save our Halkminum language. My late grandmother, Philomena Alphonse, late Violet George, Arvid Charlie, Mina Pegwadon, Florence James, Marlene Rice, late Lexi Charlie, late Ruby Peters, Gary Madsen, and Stelly Ernest Johnson. Hajkasiem.
Thank you, Ms. Alphonse. We'll now go to Ms. Bryce from Research Chair. And I don't know if Mr. Dumont is with you, but you have 5 minutes. Go ahead, Ms. Bryce.
Tantse, Tanshi, bonjour, hello. Melanie Griffith Bryce, Nitsikason, Michifnia, Kayate Lac Prairie, Ochinia Egua, de Brocher, Sagahigan, Oskana, Kaya Sa Tegi, Migwi, Migwat, Niwiken. I'm Dr. Melanie Griffith Bryce. I'm the Gabriel Dumont Research Chair in Michif and Métis Education in the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina. I'm in the process of reclaiming my language, Northern Michif, and like many Indigenous people of my generation, I do not speak my language due to the impacts of formal education and urbanization. However, I was fortunate enough to grow up hearing the language around me from my grandparents, my mother, my aunt, my uncles, and other extended family. I did learn some basic commands, but I did not develop any proficiency in the language. I recall as a child, like hearing my mother talking with others and laughing. And when I asked, what was funny, the response was always, it's not funny in English. So it's not only the humor that I lost out on, but also the knowledge that accompanies our language. As an adult, I've taken conversation classes and university classes, but only retained a few words and never enough to speak or understand. There have been two pivotal experiences that have facilitated my increased proficiency with learning my language, and both have involved language immersion techniques. The Michif language is an endangered Indigenous language with a very small group of speakers left in Western Canada who are predominantly les vieux or old ones. In Statistics Canada, they reported in 2016 that there were 9,710 Métis, or 1.7% of the Métis population, who reported being able to converse in an Aboriginal language. That census also reported that out of the more than 70 Aboriginal language spoken across Canada, by the 260,550 Aboriginal language speakers, only 1,170 of these spoke Michif. Peter Bacher, a linguist who studied the Michif language around 1988 to 1991, in his research found that the Michif language is an anomaly and that it does not fit into a language family with its mixture of Cree verbs and French nouns. It's neither an Algonquin language or an Indo-European language. But he also explained that not all mixtures of French and Cree stem from the same source as Michif, and identified 3 types of mixtures, noting that Cree French and French Cree spoken in northern areas of Saskatchewan and Alberta have no historical connection to the Michif language that is commonly referred to as Southern Michif. This needs to be noted because it does have political and cultural implications. Although the Métis National Council has identified Michif as the national language of the Métis people and our nation, Métis or Michif people also speak Nihilwan, Cree, Dene, and Anishinaabemowin, Soto. So Métis communities, if they're only provided funding for Michif, this does not honor the Cree, Dene, and Soto spoken in their respective communities. Gabriel Dumont Institute, which is the educational arm of the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, has been at the forefront of preserving Michif language through the promotion and creation of Michif resources. On their website, métismuseum.ca, they state that they employ a sociological convention when classifying a Michif language. If a Michif person living in Saskatchewan calls their language Michif, then the Institute respects their wishes and calls that language Michif. I've employed this same thinking of Michif in my research. My recommendations are based on the cultural and linguistic diversity that exists in our Métis communities across the Métis homeland, and preliminary findings from my research. I've completed 2 research projects on Michif language revitalization. The first project focused on studying the experiences of learners and fluent speakers at a land-based Michif language immersion camp, which was done in collaboration with Gabriel Dumont Institute and SUNTEP, which stands for the Saskatchewan Urban Native Teacher Education Program in Regina. Russell Theon, a faculty member at SUNTEP Regina, was a co-investigator on this project. The second study focused on effectiveness of transmitting the Michif language using video conference like Zoom in a mentor-apprentice program method by examining the experiences of the Michif language mentors and apprentices. A major obstacle I have encountered is appropriately compensating fluent language speakers to work as mentors and participate in language revitalization research projects. As I already mentioned, majority of our language speakers are older, and many are receiving a pension, and some are living on a guaranteed income supplement. Stipends or honorariums are considered income and therefore impact their annual income tax. And these changes influence their future pension and guaranteed income supplement. So they are put in a position where if they participate, they are negatively impacted. Rather than being paid for their time and the knowledge, they are penalized financially. I recommend that the remuneration received by retired, fluent Indigenous language speakers is not considered income when it is used for Indigenous language revitalization activities. Second, mentor-apprentice program has been a proven effective method of Indigenous language transmission. However, it requires considerable time and money. If someone is interested in becoming a fluent speaker, there should be opportunities for them to take time away from work to spend those hours with fluent speakers to participate in language transmission activities. Language immersion programs are more effective than one-off language learning activities, so more needs to be done to support the immersion programs in schools, in homes, and in communities. Indigenous languages need to be found in more places. We cannot rely just on schools. Communities need to be supported to create immersion programs like the Mentor Apprentice program, as well as resources to create videos, games, audio, and television programs in their target language. Ekose, Marcy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bryce, and thank you for being too polite to correct me. I thought you would be with Mr. Gabriel Dumont, but you are in fact the holder of the Gabriel Dumont Research Chair, so my apologies. So we'll now proceed with the questions. We'll start with Mr. Vidal for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank all our witnesses for joining us today. Appreciate your input. All of you are very, very educated and professional people that have done a lot of work and research and whatnot. So I'm going to frame this question really quickly, and I want to give each of you a short minute to answer it because I have a couple other questions I want to get into specifically. So if I could ask you to be just as brief as you can, I want to give you all the opportunity, though. You've all done a lot of great work and a lot of research by the sounds of it on this subject, and I would like you to just take a minute quickly and talk about the outcomes or the specific data-based results that the revitalization of languages has on the well-being of Indigenous people in our communities. So the socioeconomic, whether it's education, health, cultural well-being, representation, the data linked to how the revitalization of languages impacts those outcomes of people in the communities. Somebody can just, I can pick the order. Ms. Huron, do you want to go first? Because you were, and then we'll let each of the other witnesses go as well.
Sure. There's the, and unfortunately I'm blanking on the name, there's the Heller report that talks about the the social impacts of suicide prevention in communities with respect to language learning. There's been multiple that have come out in 2010, and unfortunately, I should have the documents here. However, AFN produced a 2017 report that has a number of there was a report on the national engagement sessions, and that cites a number of what was heard across the country from successful programming and so on. I'll shift over to my colleagues.
Go ahead, Ms. Alphonse, and then Ms. Bryce.
Thank you. Well, I would like to, I can send some documents to the committee with the research regarding well-being and connection to the language and culture. And the one thing that I keep thinking about is that language encompasses everything. And if we think about the Maori people and how they've started with their revitalizing of language, their mana, so we call it our snoeath, our spirit. So when you speak in your language, it's you're strengthening your spirit. So if you think of that soul wound that we have with the language loss and our connection to land and ceremonies and all those pieces, that is collectively is impacting us at all levels, if that makes sense. I would like to follow up with some documents.
Thank you. Ms. Bryce?
Yeah, there's already like significant research that has been conducted on the connection between Indigenous language learning and well-being within our communities. I don't have all the studies. The one that really comes to mind comes out of Dr. McIver's at the University of Victoria. There is, it would be great to have sort of maybe even somebody put in together a database where that information was easily accessible, as it would just, take, a little bit of searching to find the different research studies. But there are quite a few studies out there that can attest to that connection.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the offer to send us some of that, because that can be incorporated into our report as we come out of the study. I'm going to specify a couple questions to just individual witnesses now, because I'm going to run out of time. So, Ms. Alphonse, first to you. You talked a fair amount about technology and modern teaching methods, and even kind of got into the use of apps, and I think you talked about TikTok a little bit, or we heard actually earlier from somebody in the first panel about maybe using TikTok. And I've seen some work being done in northern Saskatchewan recently using even a virtual reality model for different purposes, and I'm just curious if you would just take a couple minutes quickly and just talk a little bit more about some of the ideas that you might have around the benefits of using modern technology to advance the work of revitalization of languages as well.
Great question, and thank you for the question. What I'm just noticing about the technology piece and the online piece is I search for Halkminum in different school districts and Simon Fraser University and all sorts of places. I'm trying to track and look for where I can find more Halkminum. And the First Voices platform as well, they've developed the keyboard and they've developed a link to many of the languages, but it's limited. It's limited in words and sentences. So there's a real disconnect of what's happening online. And apps, I think, are really accessible for youth. And also for educators, if they're in the classroom, able to use it within their classroom and curriculum. So I'm just hopeful that we can utilize the technology that's there and that there are some success, but having like what Melanie was speaking to is generating a space, a hub, where that can be very accessible for anyone to be able to develop.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't start my clock on time. Ms. Griffith-Bryce, I just really quickly then, I want to just ask you, in my own community in northern Saskatchewan, I know the elementary schools are learning some basic language, Cree, Michif, Dene, and the angle I want to come at from this, I think this is really important when we talk about reconciliation and that understanding of fostering relationship between our children as they grow up together. And I just want you to comment quickly on how that use of language within our elementary schools maybe is a really good tool to foster the relationship that ultimately leads to a reconciliation of our children as they grow up together.
Definitely with the work that many the elementary schools are doing around early learning and across the elementary grades in language learning, it has been great. Notably at Saktawak, Isle Cross, Rosignol Elementary School, they are doing phenomenal work with their, like I had the opportunity to go in and visit their pre-K kindergarten classroom, and it was just wonderful seeing the teachers who were all fluent speakers talking to these children completely in the language. And even though the children were not able to respond, they understood exactly what they were being asked to do. While these are all really great steps, the problem, the issues come in is when the language isn't being supported in the home and in the communities. So we're getting a lot of great things happening within schools, but we have to do more so that the children are immersed in this language, not just in schools, but in their homes, so that there are, I believe it was Ms. Alphonse was talking about the Language Nest initiatives that has been very, very successful with the Maori. But that is about supporting language in the home and in the community as well. And that gives opportunities for more than just the students when we look at reconciliation with the greater population, if other people have access to these language opportunities.
Thank you, Mr. Vidal.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Grateful for our three witnesses joining in virtually and also joining in person all the way also from the North Shore of British Columbia. First question I'd like to ask to Ms. Huron. You mentioned in your opening about some of the challenges so far with the implementation of the Act, particularly Sections 8 and 9. So I was wondering if you could share with this committee just some advice on how the federal government could best approach coordination with the provinces and territories in the context of this Act.
I think that, the main step is getting it on the agenda. I've been watching the agenda for the FPT meetings, and it isn't getting on that agenda. And when we look at the way those meetings are coordinated, Métis Inuit First Nations don't necessarily have a seat at the table. It's usually a pre-meeting, and sometimes they're invited as guests. So there's the question of, should they be coming into those meetings as well? I think so. But even within the pre-meetings, having a very significant point of meeting to really discuss, because this is a very complicated issue, and even when we were doing the national engagements, pulling apart what's provincial and territorial policy from what's federal policy, it's so intertwined because we just don't have these colonial boundaries that exist. So it needs to really be a conversation of how do we cross those jurisdictional hurdles.
Thank you. And you mentioned a couple of the challenges there, and noting that it may still be premature to ultimately assess this. But I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit to some aspects of the implementation of the Act that have been successful thus far, and what guidance you might have for this committee as we begin or launch the parliamentary review this fall.
So multi-year funding is one of the most significant pieces that have happened through this. The fact that people aren't having to renew their applications consistently is so helpful. Allowing for, there's a mixed piece around having the regional entities who are doing funding distribution. Very important that remain, but also considerations for if people are having challenges doing funding applications for through their regional entities. Is there a backup space? Can they also apply via the federal funding? So it's a very complex issue. Sometimes questions of dialectal politics can come into play with that. Looking at dialects is really important because they can get lost in the mix, but they can be, when you look at it from a linguistic perspective, they can triangulate languages when some languages are about to become dormant. So those dialects are key to maintaining languages that are in critical states. So all of these things are quite complicated, and the more fluidity and pathways we have, the better.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And maybe I'd like to ask my next question to Ms. Alphonse. You spoke a little bit in your opening about some of the good practices that you've seen in New Zealand with the Maori. And I was wondering if you could share those with this committee and how that might inform us in the review of this act and assessing the effect of the act to date as well.
And thank you for the question. And so for early childhood, children under the age of 6 can learn over 100 languages. And in the Maori, they developed where it was fully immersion of the Maori language within each of their communities, and they were able to revitalize it very quickly. And then they've adapted, and I've seen different changes that have happened because I went to go see New Zealand and see the early childhood programs. And there is this strength. There's a strength within their community, and they keep branching the mentorship from this elders, like sorry, Melanie, I keep going from your first name, but Melanie speaks to the elders, the eldership of the people, the key knowledge holders of the language, where then it sort of goes to the aunties and the uncles, and then it sort of branches more into that family collective space of learning. And these language nests are all supported with curriculum, and all the educators are supported within when they're learning how to become an educator, they're fully immersed in the language as well. So that's really the success. It's a hub of support of language that's within the educational systems, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you very much. And it was mentioned earlier by Ms. Huron, but there are a number of languages where I think the wording we used was there is the precariousness of the vitality of the languages, and I've certainly seen that, unfortunately, in my riding with one of the nations, with the Seashelf Nation, where some of the language is already in the process of disappearing at the moment, and it's really the dedicated work of some members of the nation that have been revitalizing that language. And in the context of the implementation of programming, what advice, Ms. Alphonse, would you have on how we can ensure that resources are allocated for those languages that are most at risk of becoming dormant or disappearing?
That was one of my talking points, is that, in looking at the stats and looking at the Indigenous Act, I could see there's variation of where funding is allocated, and really recognizing where you're saying, like the Seashelt, being able to access and have a tracked system of research of knowing where all those dialects are at within dying. And so if you find out where those are at, that's the target of trying to reach those programs first. Of revitalizing their language. That's what I would recommend.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler.
We will now go to Ms. Beribe. Ms. Beribe for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to hear more about research. When we look at current programs to fund initiatives to revitalize Indigenous languages, it's especially a matter of education. And you've all mentioned it's important. Regarding research, are there any gaps in federal funding? Some communities would like to rebuild their language, but aren't able to do it because of university or archival research. Witnesses here have also talked about obstacles to research on languages. Would you have recommendations to deal with those gaps and overcome those obstacles? So the question is for the 3 witnesses.
So we'll start with Madame Alphonse.
Thank you for the question. And I would love to see more dedicated funds to SHIRC or CIHR for revitalizing language, and that's determined within each of the communities. So there'd be a shared responsibility of funding allocated for not only for the university, but for the communities to be able to hold space to develop programs, curriculum, or technology to increase language speakers.
Ms. Huron?
So there's a few things here. I agree we need to have dedicated educational funding, but also when we look at what's happening with WIPO right now and intellectual property and the ownership of languages, this is a significant challenge. There are so linguists, because they've done the data, technically have ownership over language in which they've collected, particularly historically. So we do have very sensitive archival information that's the possession of linguists, and there's numerous cases where this data has been, and these languages have been willed to institutions or to other linguists, and there's no access points for the nations. Many times, SSHRC and other funding areas, they wind up, the publications go into, less so now with research ethics, but there's still a wall that exists for accessing research findings. When you go to pull documents, you have to be a student or you have to be a faculty member. So we need to really work on the accessibility for our nations to access the work that's been done, the results that have been done, and ensuring that there's a creation of usable data for them to work with, that this is a collaboration, not just institutions creating a wall around the information that they've harvested from our peoples.
Thank you. And Ms. Bryce?
I definitely agree with the other panelists in terms of, where the funding is directed, and as well as the knowledge ownership, not only ensuring that the communities own that knowledge, but that it is also shared with them. A lot of times, Western ways of knowing are greatly influencing how language learning and language teaching is taken up within the classroom. And we already know through research that there are practices, very effective practices that are based on Indigenous language transmission initiatives. And how can we get that information to our communities so that they are putting together programs that have already are using effective practices? And as I also mentioned in my opening remarks, how are we compensating those fluent language speakers for their time and for their knowledge? That is a huge consideration, and is definitely impacts research, because I have had many fluent speakers who are very interested in helping out, but when it goes to provide them with an honorarium because of they're on a guaranteed income supplement, they are not in a position because it impacts their income negatively. And so there's things that need to be put in place to protect that the knowledge is, as well as the time and experience that those elders and fluent speakers are bringing.
You have 1 minute and 20 seconds left. One last question. Talk about the importance of elders in transmitting language. Often, well, for elders, what can elders do to better transmit the language? Would you like to direct the question to somebody in particular? The three witnesses, please.
A minute, but the role of elders. We'll start again in the same order. Madame Alphonse.
Well, in our community, the elders, we're losing them. So a lot of them are recording the language, and Theos, Florence James from Penelakut, she's trying to create she'll do little YouTubes. And so she's trying to document as much as she can, because we're losing our elders a lot in our community. So that's the one thing that I'm really concerned about, is the elders that we're losing, and being able to hold on to the significant words that we may not know. And so it would be recording them. And like Riri Peters, she's on the Simon Fraser University website, but it's very limited to community.
Thank you. Ms. Huron.
Les aînés sont le plus.
Elders are the most significant in this whole project.
We can do nothing, and they also hold that knowledge. In working with the elders, they're the ones who can really intuitively know how we can create new words to meet these modern times, based on their innate knowledge of how the language functions. And they also hold that scientific and historic knowledge of our languages, and so that specialization that makes languages unique. Merci.
And Ms. Price?
Yeah, agreeing again with the other panelists, and just really echoing my earlier comments is we have so very few elders, and this ties into Ms. Huron. Sorry, it might be Doctor. My apologies. Comments about how having access, right, and having the elders not only in communities, but as Danielle had mentioned about banking as much of that language as possible.
Merci, Madame B.
Thank you, Ms. Beribe.
6 minutes.
Thank you, everyone. It is so good to hear everything that is being said today. As a member of Parliament for my constituents, a lot of what you have shared here today and is recognized by everyone who is Indigenous here in Canada, because our language, well, was almost beaten literally out of us. There were people who were forced to speak English and not allowed to use their mother tongue. Now, the act pertaining to Indigenous languages there will be funding allocated for each and every program, I guess, Indigenous programs. Now, my question is to you. Now, we all know up north that our children and our grandchildren are mainly speaking English now, but now for those of us who have lost our language, who have not been permitted to use our own language, we were full of anger. We were hurt. We were harmed. Now, if somebody can respond, Miranda, maybe Daniel, if you can answer this question, are you able to respond to my question? Do you see the importance of healing as a way to begin revitalizing our Indigenous languages?
Is critical, and in doing the national work, it was something we heard from everywhere, that there must be funds for creating spaces for people to heal. There was considerations for silent speakers, people who have the language innately within them from growing up around it, but because of the atrocities you're speaking about, they're afraid to speak it. They're too traumatized to speak it. And creating space for that language to come through in a healthy way again. Health is key to all of this as well. There's so many factors, and you've identified a very important one.
Ms. Alphonse, and then Ms. Bryce.
It was very powerful what you just said, and I just really want to acknowledge that, Lori, that the depth of language is the soul wound that we have with every Indigenous community of not being able to speak our languages, and the transformation that happens in healing when being able to speak fluently and be able to hold it. I just recently learned Halkaminam. I've been taking it with Theos, Florence James, and I started to cry because there was this feeling that I felt like a loss, and that grief and that shame, and like you said, that anger. I didn't realize it was sitting in me for so long. And once I was able to speak it on my own territory, there was this wave of like opening for me. And she said, your heart's opening more and you're healing because you're able to speak and connect to the language. I'm able to gather medicine and know how to talk to the plants and the trees properly. So healing is a huge piece to all of our families and our children and the communities, every community. So I just want to thank you for being able to speak to the importance of language and how it can transform and heal in really deep ways.
Ms. Bryce?
You know, again, the other panelists have said a lot of, you know, things that I can definitely echo. When looking back at the hurt in not being allowed to speak your language, but also when I think of members within my family, the shame and the ridicule when they did speak their language, and how for many Michif speakers, they were ridiculed and made fun of because of how, if they, you know, that's the only language that they came with, and they didn't speak English or French within the schools. And now being able to speak their language out in public, and the pride that they have, and what then that means for them, for their willingness to come and work with the younger people, the adult learners who want to learn the language and join in and share that pride. It definitely, you know, it heals those wounds that have been deeply, deeply scarred our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sidlaut. Colleagues, we have 10 minutes. We could do another quick round if people wish. And I'm going to assume you're okay. I'll give others if they wish to use that. Would you like to avail yourself, Mr. Schmale, or shall I go straight to Mr. Baptiste? Okay, Mr. Baptiste, if you change your mind for the end, please. Go ahead, Mr. Baptiste.
Yes, my question is around incentive for Indigenous language speakers. We often talk about the need for us to have educational programs and immersion, adult immersion. I feel like we're putting too much of a burden on educators without any incentive. How do I tell my teenage son who went to my immersion that he should continue speaking the language? What does that open up for him in opportunities? I know that if you speak the French language in Ottawa, that's obviously a benefit for jobs, for all of these different things. What incentives are out there for our youth to actually continue to speak their language? Ms. Huron, you can start.
Yeah, and this, I mean, this goes into that idea of creating a language economy, and we need to work on that because right now, it's challenging. You have single moms who are being told that they have to learn their language alongside their children and speak it alongside just existing. So it's such an impossible ask of so many people. And there's that cultural guilt if you're not learning your language. And we can't be driven by guilt. We have to be driven by celebration. So yes, you know, it was a tragedy that when this came up in this past year to see that Indigenous languages weren't being treated like minority languages for language bonuses in government. That's an easy first step for government to take. Within any workplace, having that, it should be seen as something that needs to be funded. And even within education placement and so on, it needs to be seen as something that people are striving towards. So we need to create this economy around our languages, much like has been created for minority languages in this country.
Ms. Alphonse, do you want to comment on what incentives we could create?
I'd like to change the mindset of incentive because I think having the languages is something that is a celebration, of course, but there's also this place where it needs to be immersed in community. And when we think about climate change and that we'll have lots of other communities come to Canada at some point, we're going to have to know more languages. So being able to start to have this real strong strength within speaking languages and holding on to our Indigenous languages is the incentive is connection to our land.
You think that a 13-year-old on reserve would not understand his place in the overall world's cultural, and that he would see that same incentive created?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Ms. Bryce, did you want to comment on that?
Just to build on Danielle's comment in terms of the connection to the land, already our youth are incentivized by land-based education. They enjoy going out onto the land and learning about traditional knowledges. And so I think right there's an opportunity where we start doing things with language and on the land. And many communities are already doing this because the youth are interested in getting out onto the land and learning. So we have to tie into those practices that our youth are already interested in, where our culture and our knowledges are celebrated. And you know, in terms of changing the mindsets, and similar to what Danielle said.
Thank you, Mr. Baptiste. Madame Bérubé, est-ce que
Ms. Bérubé, would you like to ask a question?
vous avez 2 minutes?
You have 2 minutes if you wish. Yes, well, I'll continue on research and the obstacles. A number of witnesses have talked about administrative difficulties, the complexity of paperwork to be filled out to obtain funding, and wait times after the submission of a plan to the department. So is this something that you've experienced?
So we can start with Ms. Bryce, if you want to comment on that, and then Ms. Alphonse, and then Ms. Huron.
Yes, you know, as an academic, I have had the experience in terms of the time that it takes to apply for research grants. And then, of course, you know, there's the waiting. And so even I have been supported, of course, through applying for grants by my institution. These same supports do not exist at the community level. Our communities do not have the same infrastructures that are set up at universities, that how I'm supported as a scholar to submit grant applications. And so there are things that need to be in place that are supportive and help our communities to, you know, get over these obstacles around, you know, as you say, the administrative side in terms of the paperwork, and especially when you have communities where their first language is not English or French, and that's what the application has to be in. So there's accommodations that need to be made. I could say.
Thank you, Ms. Alphonse.
I'm just going to agree with Ms. Bryce, and that, yeah, that's the true fact, is that there needs to be sort of a weight of funding that can support communities within the research. And then also, just in thinking about elders, being really careful if we're going to be doing more research with elders in language, how much we're utilizing each of those elders within those language groups. Because I think we can overuse elders as well, and we have to be very careful and protective of those people.
Thank you, and Ms. Huron.
Yes, and echoing what my two colleagues have said, also looking at, you know, there are great organizations like First Peoples Cultural Council who are doing regional work to go out into community to support some of that filling out of applications. But a lot of times, if you're a single teacher in your community, it's hard to put your hand up for that help or know where those pathways are. So even just communicating what those pathways are, and it's, you know, it's one of those things, it's such a hard thing to get the word out in the right ways that people will hear it and know how to do it. So it's a challenge.
Thank you. And Ms. Seelout, if you'd like to conclude.
Thank you. Question for Melanie. You mentioned earlier elders, when they receive honoraria, that they are taxed as an income, and it affects their income support or pension. I was told that by my people. Same. How would you recommend to change that so it does not affect the elders' income? Or if we truly value our language, how do we protect it by protecting the elders?
Thank you. I think that we need to make sure income tax law, I'm not too sure about all that, but if there's a way that honorariums can be seen as not income for people who are over the age of 60 or 65, if there was some way that could be reported, and it's not so much that what I have found with the elders that they're not they don't mind paying the tax on that, but what they do mind is that it's considered as income. And so once, for example, with the guaranteed income supplement, if you receive over $20,000, $20,000 is not a lot of money, but as soon as you go over that, it's taken off the next year. So while they receive that honorarium that year, then that means the next year they receive less money because they're being penalized for helping out, for wanting to revitalize their language. And so there has to be something in place that our elders are not penalized.
Thank you very much. This brings our second panel to a close. I'd like to thank Ms. Huron, Ms. Alphonse, and Ms. Bryce for providing your testimony today. Quite often you all agreed with each other, which I think makes it very strong what you said today. We very much appreciate it as we continue our study of Indigenous languages and of the Act itself. So thank you for giving us your time and your testimony today. With that, colleagues, I call this meeting to a close. Adjourned.